So the Hughes Kettner Warp X, a little bit of an underrated gem in terms of high gain amps. I was sort of first introduced to the Hughes Kettner amps back in 2004 when I decided to migrate from my little Marshall combo to a full-grown big boy amp. And I was actually in the market for a PV5150 at the time. And this was in the period, I think the 5150 had just been discontinued and the 6505 wasn't quite out yet. So the local music store actually convinced me to come down and have a look at Hughes Kettner Warp T. And this thing just looked tough. So you've got the black metal grille, you've got the red lighting behind it. And as soon as I plugged into it and played, it actually sounded every bit as good as it looked. So I walked away with that amp, and that was my main amp for the next couple of years. Played a few gigs with it in a previous band. And a couple of years later, once I got my Mesa dual rectifier, I decided to let it go. And that was a gigantic mistake. Loved the rectifier, but it wasn't as easy just to plug in and get a great sound out of. And I was really missing just having that amp that I knew I could just plug into, and it was great. So I spent the next couple of years looking on the used market for another Warp T. And that's sort of where I realized how rare they actually are. Like, there's not a lot of them in existence. And it was just through pure chance that I actually put a message out on Facebook, and a guy messaged me back and said he had a Warp X that he was willing to part with. And I jumped all over it because basically the Warp X sort of come out in like end of 2004, 2005. And this is exactly the same amp as the Warp T, just with some cosmetic differences. So they changed the chassis. Gone now is the metal faceplate and more into the traditional Hughes and Kettner plexiglass with the lighting behind it. But the internals of the amp are exactly the same. So that came up and I thought, yeah, I've got to get that. So here I am with this fairly beat up excuse for a Warp X, but it is still an amazing sounding amp. So I'm going to try and do something that I've never attempted before, and I'm going to try and capture some profiles of this tone with the Warp X into Kemper and into a Neural DSP Quad Cortex. And at the end of the video, we'll do a little bit of a shootout and compare the three tones between the real amp tone, the Kemper, and the Quad Cortex. And also I'll make the profiles available for you guys, and you'll be able to download them. I'll put a link in the description. So let's have a little bit more of a look at the Hughes Kettner Warp X. So I'm going to be reamping the tracks you heard in the demo at the start there through this rig. So we're going to be going from a reamp box out into this boost pedal here. We're using the Boss SD1 overdrive. Got a noise gate in behind that just because this thing is a little bit noisy. I've also got another noise gate hooked up in the effects loop there, and I've got an EQ pedal in there as well. There's a few frequencies that I just wanted to pull out and add a few other ones as well. When I'm reamping, I do like to get my tone as close to possible as ready straight out of the box. So I find putting the EQ in the loop, I can pull a few things out, and it saves me doing post-processing later. So all this is running into a Mesa Boogie rectifier cab. So here's a miking setup that we used at the start of the video. We've got SM57 just in your typical spot there on the speaker, and I've got an Audix D6 as another mic there, and that's just giving a little bit more beef and a bit more low end to the tone. So we've got a little bit of a blend of them going. But for the purpose of the video, I've actually shot some impulse responses of this miking setup, and we're going to be re-recording our amp tone through a Torpedo Live loadbox and just recording the direct signal and then using the impulse response of these mics. And when I create the profiles with the Kemper and the Quad Cortex, they're going to be direct profiles as well. So that'll give me the ability to swap out the impulse responses later on if I think I need to. All right, so I've got my song demo here in front of us, and let's take a little bit of a listen. We've got the backing tracks, we've got a couple of bass tracks, some programmed drums. My red tracks here, these are the DIs of our guitars that we recorded earlier. And that's what we're going to be sending out through the reamp box back to the amp and then back through the modelers once we get the profiles done. So these orange tracks here are just some prints I've done through the Archetype Gojira plugin. And I like to do this, I just like to have a reference tone to sort of go for. I know that it's a different amp, it's a different miking setup, but I like to have something when I'm dialing in an amp tone, when I'm reamping, to aim for. So I know if I get something that sounds similar or close to this, it's going to be a good result in the end. So these tracks sound a little bit like this. So that's sort of been my go-to tone for when we're demoing stuff. So I know that it does sound good. These tracks in yellow here, these are the mic'd up tracks that I've reamped earlier with the mic setup behind me. So this is what the SM57 track sounds like by itself. And the D6 by itself sounds a bit like this. So we can hear that that one sounds a lot darker, but when we blend the two together, so 57 by itself, blend in the D6, I'm going to take the D6 out. It's a lot thinner, it's got that mid-range snarl on that mic, but it doesn't have much volume to it. When I put the D6 back in, you can hear that it kind of fills out the bits that are missing from the 57 alone. So that's why I like to use two different microphones at times. Don't always do it, but in this occasion I felt there was just something missing from the 57 alone, so I added the extra microphone. So let's have a listen to both of those guitar tracks now. And with the backing tracks. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to send those DIs back out and reamp them again. And the output of the amp's actually going to come back into the Torpedo Live load box. And once I'm done with that, we will add the impulse response of our mic setup back onto the tracks using a cabinet loader. Okay, so we've got our direct tracks now recorded from the amp, and they sound like this. So yeah, not very pretty, but when we add the impulse response, as you can see here, I've just got my Mesa 57 D6 blend. So it's impulse response taken of the two mics there behind me. It sounds a little bit more like this. So if we listen back to our original amp tracks, and to our new track, so they're not too dissimilar at all. So that is the impulse response we're going to use once we make the profiles. We're going to jump into that now. So I'm going to hook up everything to the Kemper, and we're going to get the profiling process started using the Kemper. Right, so we've got everything hooked up through the Kemper. It is a little bit of a weird setup with all the cables you need to make this happen, but we've got there in the end. So yeah, this is the Kemper tone. This is just a random Kemper patch at the moment. So what we actually need to do is we need to throw the Kemper into profiler mode, and it'll come up with a heap of different options here. So at the moment, this is our Kemper sound. We hit reference here. This should be our Hughes and Kettner. Alright, so on this screen here, we've got a couple of options here to change the EQ on the way into the Kemper. I'm going to leave them flat for now because I want to sort of see what it's going to come up with on its own without affecting the tone too much as it comes in. We need to make sure that we've got this button pushed here, so we've got no cabinet attached, so it'll make a direct profile there. Once we're happy with all that, we hit start and it'll make some weird noises in the background. Alright, it's done its thing now, and we've got our profile. That's our Kemper Profile. This is our original amp. Kemper. Original amp. As I said, this is the first time I've tried to profile an amp, so I'm not going to play around with this stuff too much because I don't know exactly what it does. But we will refine the profile, so we need to hit this, and then we need to just play a heap of different stuff over the neck. When we're done with that, that'll apply a few changes in the background. Back to our reference tone. Alright, so that's our profile there. I'm pretty happy with that for now. Once we save it, we will be able to tweak some things. I feel like that's got a little bit more gain than what the original amp tone has. So we will tweak that a little bit, but for now, we need to just store it. But there we go. Now we should have our profile. Let's go back to performance mode. Now you can hear it's picked up all the noise from the amp, so we may need to just adjust the noise gate a little bit here on this. Like I was saying, I feel like it's got a little bit more gain than what the original has, so. I'm going to back that down a little bit. So there's our rough and ready Kemper profile. Let's hook up the Quad Cortex now and see what it comes up with. Alright, so we've got the Quad Cortex hooked up now, and the cool thing about the Quad Cortex is we could also clone pedals if we wanted to with this thing. So I could take the overdrive out of the front of the amp now, we could make a model of it, we could make a model of, say, another one of my drive pedals like the Dirty Tree or the Plumes or a Tube Screamer, and we could add that in front of the amp later. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to keep everything as it is, and we're going to bake the boost into the amp. So the first thing we've got to do here is we have to go new neural capture, and this will give us our diagram for how all of our cables have to be hooked up. I've got this all done already, so we can just skip to this part. So if we hear now, so the amp is now going through the pedal, and we are ready to hit capture on this one. So this does a heap of stuff in the background, similar to the Kemper. I can't actually hear the signals that are going out through this one. I have seen some videos of people in the past. I don't know whether it's an update to the firmware or whatever, but We don't get all them weird noises at the moment, so that's kind of cool. It does take a little bit longer than the Kemper, but I'm sure we're still going to end up with a very good result from it. All right, we're all done. Here's the Cortex. Here's our reference amp. Cortex again. So one thing that I can say off the bat there, and I have seen this in a lot of other videos about Cortex profiles, is they do sound a little bit darker and probably a little bit less gain than the original. I mean, in this case, I think that the gain is probably about the same, but the Cortex profile is definitely a bit darker. So that might be something that we look at when we start to refine these patches, but let's save that now. We're going to call it Warp X. Save. Done. All right, so we've got that sorted. What we're going to do now is I'm going to plug my guitar into the input of the pedal. We're going to make a new preset. I'm going to add my capture of my Warp X. Now we've got all the noise from the amp, like I was saying before, so I think what I'll have to do is I'll have to add a noise gate in front of the patch. And we've got rid of all our noise. So same as before, I'm going to feed our DI signals back out, reamp them through the pedal, and then we'll have a look at comparing the three tones that we've got. All right, so I've got all of our tracks reamped now. We've got our amp tracks here in yellow. This lighter yellow is our Kemper Profile, and the green is the Quad Cortex. So let's have a listen to these in the context of the mix now and see if we can pick up any differences straight away with it. So first off, let's have a listen to our Gojira plugin and hear what that sounds like. All right, let's have a listen to our amp tone. Let's have a listen to our Kemper Profile. And finally, our Quad Cortex tone. So straight away, we can definitely hear the differences with the Kemper tone. It seems a little bit more mid-forward than the other two do. It's not quite as scooped. But listen to those in solo, pick a different part of the song here, and let's compare them back to back in solo, and we should be able to pick out the differences a little bit easier. So let's compare the amp and the Quad Cortex. the Quad Cortex profile definitely sounds a lot closer to our amp tone. I have gone in and tweaked a few things on both the Kemper and the Quad Cortex prior to mixing these down. As I mentioned when we were doing the profiling, the Quad Cortex did sound a lot muddier, and the Kemper was a little bit oversaturated, so I pulled the gain back a little bit on that. But pretty surprised at how different the Kemper actually does sound in these profiles. But let's have a little bit of a deep dive into it, and we might pull up a spectrum analyzer on our Kemper profile here, and let's have a look at the differences between our amp and our Kemper profile. So this will come up, the red line will be our amp profile, the frequency response of it, and the grey line will be the Kemper profile. So we should be able to point out whatever differences there may be there. So the top end response is a little bit different between the Kemper. We can see we've definitely got a little bit more mid information here than we do on the red line of the amp. We'll probably pull a little bit of a bell down here and try and tame those mids a little bit. See if that gets us a little bit closer. Let's compare the two now. They definitely do sound pretty different from one another there, and I'm not sure whether that's just a result of the profiling process, like with the algorithms used. I could probably go in and refine the profile a little bit more in the Kemper, but it still does sound pretty good in the context of the mix. So it may not be as close as the Quad Cortex profile to the original tone, but it is still a pretty cool tone all in all anyway. So let's do the same with the Quad Cortex tone now. So once again, the red line will be our amp tracks, and the grey line will be the Quad Cortex. So we can see straight away with this profile, this is almost identical. This line's just about matching up completely with our amp tone. Let's compare them. That profile sounds a hell of a lot closer to the real amp. It is still a little bit darker sounding than the actual amp. Let's jump into a different part of the song here, and let's compare these tones in the mix again. So first off, we've got our amp tone. Let's have a listen to this different riff here. Alright, so there we go. There's definitely some differences between those profiles. But they all sound really good in the mix regardless. The Quad Cortex definitely does sound closer to our original tone than the Kemper Profile, but the Kemper Profile still does sound good in the mix too, so I'd be happy to use any of them. So which one do you guys think sounds better? Let us know in the comments. So if you want to download those profiles, if you're a Kemper user or a Quad Cortex user, I'll leave a link in the description. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It helps us out a lot with the YouTube algorithm. And hopefully we'll see you on the next one.